afternoon and good morning to those of you on the West Coast. I want to welcome you to Making the Class, Shaping the Class, a panel discussion of emerging issues in enrollment leadership. My name is Kim Reid. I'm the Vice President of Research Operations here at Maguire Associates. We're very pleased to host this discussion today. It is based on research that we've been conducting on behalf of the Chronicle of Higher Education. And our discussion today will be moderated by a best-selling author and Chronicle contributing editor, Jeff Selingo. We're also joined today by two wonderfully experienced enrollment managers, Pamela Horne of Purdue University and Matt Fissinger of Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. So by way of introduction, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the influences that Jeff and I discussed in designing this study. We certainly wanted to look at the practice of enrollment management in our environment today, with the understanding that there have been some major influences on your industry in the last few years that you deal with every day. And the two major things that we see are certainly the need to articulate value and the demographic reality. So we know that we've been experiencing demographic shifts and that those really have set in at this point in time. And these two things are major influences in how you go about your work. So this discussion today is really going to focus on how forward-thinking enrollment leaders should navigate that environment. For that reason, I'm going to show you a few individual pieces of data from the study, but most of our time today will be spent with Jeff commenting on the environment and our panelists discussing how they approach these issues at their individual institutions. A little biography before we go. Jeff Selingo, as I said, is a best-selling author and award-winning columnist who helps parents and higher education leaders imagine the college and university of the future. He is the author of College Unbound, The Future of Higher Education and What It Means for Students, which was a New York Times best-selling education book in 2013. His latest book, MOOC U, Who is Getting the Most Out of Online Education and Why, was published this September. And he's also currently working on a book on the post-college job market that will come out in 2016. So Jeff is a very busy man with a lot of ideas, and we're happy to have him here. He's been the top editor at the Chronicle of Higher Education, and now he's currently a contributing editor. He's also a professor of practice at Arizona State University. His writing has been published widely. He's been honored by many associations, including the Education Writers Association and the Society of Professional Journalists and the Associated Press. And Jeff can be seen across the country at lots of conferences and universities as a keynote speaker discussing his ideas on education. Jeff, would you like to say hello?
Yeah, it's great to be here, and I look forward to the conversation. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you. Our next panelist is Pamela Horne, who is the Associate Vice Provost for Enrollment Management and the Dean of Admissions at Purdue University, where she's been for quite some time. At Purdue, she manages strategy and operations for admissions, financial aid, early college outreach, the registrar, enrollment analysis, and reporting. She's been at other institutions of distinction, such as Michigan State University, the University of Michigan, Eastern Michigan University, and the University of Kansas. In her time, both in Indiana and in Michigan, Pam has spent a lot of time working with the state on educational issues related to the transition from secondary to post-secondary education. Pam is very active in the College Board. She's currently a trustee of the College Board. She is the past chair of the Midwestern Regional Council. She's been a member on the Task Force on Admissions in the 21st Century and the SAT committees, as well as other committees in her time with the College Board. She currently facilitates NACAC's Chief Enrollment Officer's Pre-Conference Workshop and ACRO's Public Policy Advisory and Nominations and Elections Committees. She's also a frequent presenter at national and regional meetings. Many of you have probably seen her speak on topics such as the gap between college aspiration and preparation, the future of enrollment management, and many other topics to boot. Our final presenter is Matt Fissinger. Matt is the Director of Undergraduate Admission at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. He's been there since 1990, and prior to his work at LMU-LA, Matt spent many years at Boston College, which was his alma mater. In addition to his responsibilities in admission, which include certainly marketing, recruitment, and selection at LMU, Matt is a senior member of the enrollment management team and is deeply involved in implementation of strategic financial aid, packaging, and efforts to optimize retention. He also is responsible for new student orientation. Matt, too, is involved as an active member of NACAC and the Conference of Jesuit Admissions Directors. He is also a frequent presenter of admissions-related topics, and Matt's particular area of interest is in demystifying and de-stressing the admission process for prospective students. His essay, Students, You Are Important and You Can Take Control, is published in Lloyd Thacker's 2004 College Unranked, and he frequently speaks on this topic to parents. As I said, I've already introduced myself, so I won't spend much time on myself. Just to know, again, my name is Reid. I have 20 years of experience in education research overall, 10 years of that focused on enrollment management, research, and consulting, and I have the privilege of being the research partner here at Maguire with Jeff and the Chronicle on the many studies that we've pursued together, so I'm very happy to be here. Just a little brief bit about the study. So, as I said, many of you may have responded to this study. We fielded it in July of 2014. It was a survey that is a national sample of enrollment leaders at public and not-for-profit four-year institutions. We got 435 enrollment leaders to respond from institutions of all kinds, which was fantastic. And if you're interested in the full report, you can go to the Chronicle's website and download it at this link, which you should be able to see later on when you do get the shared link of this webinar, if you can't write it down right now. So let's get started, and let's first of all turn our first topic to the idea of the emerging environment. What is it and where is it going? In order to think about that, I want to first present a piece of data from our study. I apologize for the small print here, but I think this is important to understand where your thinking is. We asked enrollment leaders how concerned they are about the following issues facing college enrollment. And the important thing to see here is if you look at the green and the dark blue, these are issues there where people were very concerned or extremely concerned. And we can see that most of these relate to the idea of value. The first one is the sustainability of the high-cost, high-discount pricing model for higher education, the public focus on defining the value of higher education, the discussion of a student debt bubble in the public sphere, and the possibility of government accountability for higher education. So there's clearly a concern around value, which we will discuss today. The second piece of information I wanted to show you is related to the demographic environment. This chart is broken down by public and private institutions. We asked leaders how their institution has felt the effects of the changing demography for traditional undergraduates in the last 5 years, and we can certainly see that everybody is experiencing some kind of changing economic mix of students, especially private institutions. And we can see that everybody is experiencing some kind of, not everybody, but most people are experiencing some kind of changing racial and ethnic mix, more so in publics than in privates. And more than half of all institutions are experiencing declining regional markets. The counterpoint to that is that fewer than a quarter of institutions are experiencing growing markets. And this is most informative for how you think about your work. Fundamentally, what it's telling us is that we're not in a growth market. We're in a market that's all about building market share and where not everyone can win. Everybody wants to win, but not everybody can. And so the question is, what are smart enrollment leaders doing to navigate that environment successfully? And what does it mean to be successful in that environment? Related to that, we asked institutions how they sought to mitigate changes in demography. And you can see here, there's certainly things that many of you are familiar with. Folks have reconfigured marketing plans. They've made efforts to increase international student enrollment. They've made efforts to increase market share in traditional markets, which relates to the prior slide. And they've been developing new domestic markets. I think it's interesting here that more people are moving international than are looking at domestic growth. And that might be a subject of conversation for later as we move into our discussion portion of this. The other piece that I really wanted to emphasize on this slide is the bottom data point. Institutions that have considered downsizing or right-sizing their enrollment. Very few. 12% of publics and privates have considered this option. And as we see, few institutions are accepting the reality of the market in its face. And to my earlier point, not everybody is going to come out on top here. Some people are going to do well and some people are not. And the question is, can we continue to grow, or do we actually have to accept that some of us are going to be smaller institutions? So So I'd like to turn the conversation over to Jeff and our panelists now. Jeff, would you provide your viewpoint on some of the things I just talked about?
Yeah, Kim, thanks again for inviting me and everybody for joining this important conversation. I think on the state of admissions and enrollment management in higher education. The Chronicle first did a survey with Maguire on admissions back in 2008, and what struck me is in some of the differences in the responses is how unpredictable, in some ways, admissions has become, particularly in recent years, no matter which kind of institution you're at, and how different the enrollment management and admissions and the job of admissions director or enrollment management has become between institutions. And so what interested me about the survey, and again, I encourage you to download the full survey in the address that Kim gave, is how in some cases, private baccalaureate colleges are doing better on some fronts than public comprehensive universities, while flagships have other issues that the other two sectors don't have. And so when anybody talks about, and I know the media loves to talk about higher education in one big way, the fact of the matter is, and many of you on this call know, that it's incredibly different between sectors when it comes to admissions and even within institutions within the sectors. We didn't even ask questions about value last time we did this survey, which I think shows really how much this discussion has shifted in the last 4 or 5, 6 years, especially since the economic downturn of 2008. And I also think it reflects the changes in the tools that students and parents and families now have available to them. Whether it's the state databases that now allow students to look at earnings by major that are linked to unemployment insurance records, whether it's a whole new set of rankings out there that measure value in ways that weren't even measured, again, a decade ago, whether it's the new tools that LinkedIn put out recently, using its outcomes-based algorithm that it's able to collect from people who have LinkedIn profiles. And of course, then there is the whole rating system that the Obama administration wants to put in place. And so this idea that we know higher education is valuable as a whole, if you look at any survey, 90+% of people want their kids to go to college, but now there's much more of a question between the value of college A versus college B versus college C, and I'll be very interested in asking our guests particularly about that. The two other things that struck me, and then I want to get right into the questions, was one was kind of a lack of strategy for many admissions officers. Again, if we look back on the survey in 2008, we saw that things were pretty steady state, which allowed many admissions offices, not all, of course, but many admissions offices, to really think about 4, 5, 6 years out and to come up with real strategies. Now it seems like there's such a focus, and especially particularly from the top officials at the university and colleges, asking for data all the time about, well, how are we doing for next year? What's the discount rate? How are we doing on admissions and yield and so forth? And so there's really kind of a year-to-year feeling among some of the admissions officials. And then finally, and Kim mentioned kind of the uptick in international, the uptick in other strategies, short-term strategies, I would call them, in some cases. And I'm kind of curious, again, in the discussion today about how sustainable some of these are. In other words, if everyone starts going international, what's the differentiation on that piece of it? And so we really are looking at how potentially colleges can be more strategic in the future around these things. And what I really want to know is, getting down to the cost question, is how can we change kind of the cost structure of higher ed, and really should that be something that admissions officials have to look into? And then I'll also ask some questions about demographics as well. So again, glad that Pam and Matt could join us. And Pam and Matt, I guess I'll open up with the question on value. Do you get the sense that the public is much more interested in the value of specific institutions now, rather than just the value of higher education overall?
Sure, Jeff. This is Pam, and I'll start out. And again, welcome everyone. I'm happy to be a part of this. I think that, yes, the questions about value are increasing, probably not in exactly the same ways that they're discussed at the federal level, at the state level, but I think families certainly are asking more questions about graduation rates. They're asking more questions about costs, not only for the first year, but about 4 years. And they're wondering what might happen with tuition, room, and board costs over the span of my student's enrollment at a particular institution. They're asking about placement rates, starting salaries by major, and return on investment questions in general. Jeff, would you agree?
Matt, would you?
I'm sorry, Jeff.
Yeah, I would.
Matt, would you
I would agree with that. Thanks. Good morning, everybody. It is morning still on the West Coast. I would agree with this, and one of the ways I've come to think about it is that, students, especially at the exploratory or research stage into colleges and universities for them, have, kind of added value in whatever way they view it. It could be return on investment, it could be affordability, could be outcomes, et cetera, right up at the top of the funnel. So at a college fair, where students used to walk up and ask us where we're located and what majors we have and how big the university is, et cetera, are now just as likely to ask questions at that very early stage about value, reflecting that it's just become a cornerstone or a foundation of the way that they're processing and gathering this information.
But at the same time, of course, value is a fuzzy word, right? Value is really in the eye of the beholder. I might think of products valuable where you don't. And unfortunately, I think in higher ed, value right now is really focused on, graduate outcomes, particularly around economic outcomes. So, do you have a job and how much do you make? And we all know that college contributes so much more to a person's life over their entire course of their lifetime than just a job and a salary. So how do you shift that conversation from just being about a job and salary, while at the same time respecting that parents and students are asking a lot more questions about this?
Well, that's kind of the $1 million question. I think it's a really hard element to interject at this point in time, because people are really have been, I think, influenced by the feds and by media and all kinds of folks to really be worried about the more quantitative and dollars and cents measures of this. So it's a challenge and it's a struggle. We've taken to developing and circulating and even bringing with us to college fairs and stuff success stories from our students that include some real sort of plum kind of career outcomes, but also stories that get at the very kind of things that you're alluding to, Jeff, the lifelong value, the contributions that their education makes in realms that are hard to measure. Even, are you a better parent? Are you a better citizen? Are you conversant on the kinds of things that your bosses are going to want you to be knowledgeable about when you go to work? But that's so elusive to measure that you always feel like you're fighting an uphill battle, I'm afraid.
Pam, any thoughts on that?
I do, and I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the Gallup-Purdue Index
Yes.
in this regard. Wouldn't I, Jeff? And I would refer the participants in the webinar to that, but the survey that was conducted by the Gallup organization with our support and the support of the Lumina Foundation interviewed several 100,000 college graduates from around the country and found some very strong connections between pivotal, what we're calling high-impact experiences during college in association then with outcomes such as satisfaction in one's personal life as well as engagement in the workforce. And the results are pretty compelling. And I think it can show us and help us define what are those experiences during the college years that directly connect with those kinds of outcomes, including those more elusive ones that Matt mentioned. But I do think that for those of us who are formulating these messages and recruiting students that we probably have shifted the balance a little bit in terms of how we talk about the experiences students are going to have in our collegiate environments versus what the impact of those experiences are going to be on their future. We have to do both, and it probably depends on the audience and the kinds of questions as to what that balance is going to be. But I would say that we probably shifted toward the outcomes. But I think if you look at internships, study abroad, finding a mentor in college, doing undergraduate research, we can now point through research that those kinds of activities, if we provide them, we encourage students to engage in them, that those will be associated with positive outcomes later on in life.
What are the questions that you're hearing from parents and students and counselors that you hear often today that you either rarely heard or never heard 5 or 6 years ago? Pam, do you have any thoughts on that, or Matt?
Well, I have to say that probably the questions that increase every year is a strong desire for merit aid. Mm-hmm. When I talk with my colleagues around the country, we sort of dread March and April because of the faxes and emails and phone calls. I don't entirely blame parents. I think higher ed has contributed to this. I think in many ways we're on a merit aid merry-go-round. Certainly the media, from NPR to the Today Show to Fox News, all are saying, oh, no financial aid offer is final. And so they're encouraged to try to negotiate. But I'm finding it extremely uncomfortable that many parents look at the college choice as an opportunity to almost auction off their students.
Well, and we saw from the survey that merit aid is increasingly a strategy that not only is everyone using, but using more and more often. And I think this gets back to the sustainability argument, is that you only could go to the well so many times, whether it's international students, whether it's merit aid, whether it's instituting new policies around the wait list or early action or whatever it is. And it seems to me, and I would love to get your thoughts on this, Pam and Matt, is do you feel like some days that what you're really doing is short-term planning, again, to get to that class next year rather than the long-term issues that higher education as a whole really needs to tackle, or do you feel like you're able to do both? Matt, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that, Pam talks about March and April. Those are our favorite months. And in that environment, it's really all short term. Those kind of conversations are just really focused on the students who are trying to do their best to make a good choice. And relating that back to the admission funnel and the role of value, I see that by the time we get to that stage, the students have kind of accepted our explanation or description of the value that an LMU education might offer, and are very anxious to come and are trying to find a way to do that. Merit aid plays a big role in a lot of their approaches, and related to that, a more and more debt-averse kind of mentality filters in as well. And so, you're just caught up for a couple of months doing nothing but short-term planning and discussing related to those very real and immediate issues for your prospective students. To the extent that you can kind of step back and address the longer term, you really have to take advantage of already busy but less immediately focused summer months and early fall, and try to engage your leadership in that kind of a discussion to help them understand that just because you have been successful for the last couple of years doesn't mean that you feel confident that all those conditions are going to continue.
I think that's an excellent point, and I find that I'm spending more and more of my time actually doing internal education about the marketplace, about the pipeline, about enrollment projections, and we're really pretty good at those. But I would invite actually the participants in the webinar to go to Purdue's enrollment management website. which is not a recruiting website. It's all about internal communication and sharing of data and information. And a lot of what we do, at least in my environment, which is a large environment, faculty are not always directly involved in the recruitment process. As a matter of fact, most are not. Some of what we have to do and some of the market forces come as great surprises to them. Volume of what we deal with. So I spend a lot of time doing education, from trustees to faculty senate committees, et cetera. But in terms of the long term, there are two things that we have to pay attention to, I think. One is that the short-term fixes, as it were, huge search, tons of merit aid on the table, might have a shorter-term impact. But if we can't deliver the quality of experience that students and families are looking for, and if we don't change in that regard, then those are just short-term fixes. Those can't be sustained if you're not constantly addressing the undergraduate experience and teaching students how to engage in that experience. The other long-term investment that I think all of us need to make, and as a public university representative, I feel particularly strongly about this, is that we have to ensure that more American students are prepared for higher education. Colleges and universities may have some responsibility for poor completion rates, but we need to partner with secondary schools, with state governments, with school districts, with the federal government to ensure that more students are prepared for the rigors of our environment. That's kind of a passion of mine, but it's also self-survival. If we really want to deal with these changing demographics, we not only need to get more students, young people in college, but we also need to make sure that they're prepared to be successful.
There's one fact that I like to share on the demographics, because it's something that I think really people start to really think about where we're going, particularly around income. And we know from the recent jobless statistics, the unemployment rate is obviously dropping, but it's not that sometimes we have an unemployment problem in this country. We actually have, in some cases, much more of a wage problem, and that wages are essentially flat or declining. And one of the things that was in a recent report in the Chronicle around demographics was that there's about 450 counties in this country where there are more younger people than older people. In other words, your future students. And the number that really caught me here was that in all but 100 of them, so in about 350 of those counties, they're lower than the national median income today. And so you're really kind of pressing up against these forces that haven't existed given the broad swath of students now going to college. We've never really seen this before. And I mean, everybody knows the demographic change is coming. In fact, we're already in the midst of it in many ways. But do you feel like everybody's just holding off, thinking, well, maybe it'll be next year, maybe it'll be next year, or do you feel like everybody is really ready for it in your mind? And I'm not talking about your colleagues in other admissions offices elsewhere else, but I'm really talking about the institution, Pam. So, for example, you were talking about internal education. I mean, do you really think the faculty or other senior administrators who are not dealing with this day in and day out really understand what's coming?
I think that in many cases, trustees and presidents think that their particular institution will be the exception. That we cannot accept that we might be the losers, as Kim was describing. There can't help but be winners and losers in the next 10 years. But I think the survey for the Chronicle showed that one of the greatest challenges that folks in the position that Matt and I have is unrealistic expectations. And I'm not saying that happens at Purdue. I think our folks they may not like the reality always when I share it with them, but they're smart people who are willing to look at it. But I do think around the country that expectations are pretty unreasonable. And Matt and I have any number of friends who've lost their jobs this year because of those kinds of unrealistic expectations. And somehow the grass is always going to be greener. And our particular institution will beat the odds.
Yeah, I agree with Pam. I think that, to answer your question, Jeff, when you first posed it, is anybody ready? I think nobody's ready, really. And I think that the environment that Pam describes, where everybody thinks that it won't happen to them or it won't affect us, is prevalent. it's an interesting kind of dichotomy because I don't think they're unaware of they've seen the studies, they understand the demographics, but they're kind of counting on the enrollment officers to figure out a way that it won't happen to them, and that's where the unrealistic expectations come in.
Matt, do you have any, Pam described the site that they have to educate kind of internal audiences. Do you have any strategy there to educate, whether it's faculty, whether it's other senior administrators, whether it's trustees or alumni or whoever it might be? Have you changed your strategy or have a strategy now about how to educate them about what is going on so that those expectations are not so unrealistic? They're probably always going to be unrealistic, but they're not so unrealistic.
Yeah, I'm going to go look at Pam's website because it sounds like that could be useful to us. But these occur more, and these are regular, actually, topics of conversation at the Provost Council. And LMU is a medium-sized institution, and it's really possible to get, most of the senior management and influencers together on a fairly regular basis. And one of the things that we talk about a lot at the Provost Council has to do with forecasting and the future and the kinds of realities and pressures that we just really have to have everybody understand and can't avoid. So it's more individual and traditional in the kind of meeting and education kind of way, not yet developed into kind of a well-structured website with reams of data and lots of information. But I think, in reflection of the culture of the institution and the size, the same kind of consistent effort is underway, led by the enrollment folks, to make sure that these conversations are never in the background and are not few and far between, but rather pretty constant fodder for the Provost Council.
Great. This is Kim. I'm going to jump in a moment with a chat question from our group before we probably move on to the next topic. But we've got a couple questions. One of them is, are you, either Matt or Pam, do you feel any pressure that you're losing to lower cost institutions yet? Are you seeing either lower cost privates or regional publics or community colleges in your sphere at all? And if so, how are you working with those kinds of entities to potentially build pipelines?
Well, for us, as a public institution, we have always lost, to a certain extent, out-of-state students to their home flagships, and that continues. We have not yet seen a shift of students choosing lower-cost public institutions in the state or community colleges. I think that, however, the next tier, as it were, public institutions are very much challenged. There was a recent article, I believe, in the Chronicle about that the state institutions that are not at the flagship level may be among those institutions, along with some small privates, that will be the most challenged over the next 5 or 10 years, again, particularly in the Midwest and the Northeast, where the population is diminishing. And those institutions are, in some cases, I think, starting to lose students possibly to the community colleges. And so you do see a number of institutions really stepping up their transfer efforts and pipelines. And I'll have to say we're stepping that up as well.
Kim, I would say that, in California, for any of the private institutions, the competition from the University of California system has forever been, kind of a real challenge for us, because they're very well regarded, even in, an era where they've suffered budget cuts and things like that, but still very well regarded and relatively economical by comparison to the privates. And so that's an ongoing kind of challenge for any private institution in California. With regard to lower cost privates, what we see at LMU is just a lot of institutions, back to the merit aid topic, putting more money into merit aid, and whether they're lower cost than us on the face of it or not, offering students packages that cost them less in a real way. And we've lost students to institutions that we never used to because they've been very aggressive in that regard.
Okay, thanks, Matt. I have one more question that I'm going to ask in this section, then we'll move on. We have a question that says, is there a specific office or position which should be charged with formulating long-term enrollment solutions? How is that? Does that go beyond your offices, or how is that happening at your institutions?
Well, I think it has to be led by enrollment management, but if we do it by ourselves, we won't get very far. So, again, back to this, idea of a regular sort of forum for the deans and the senior vice presidents and the provost to kind of be involved in these kind of conversations is really a critical sort of thing.
I would agree. I'm not so certain about enrollment solutions. Certainly, enrollment projections need to be done by people who understand statistics, et cetera, et cetera. And so whether you have that expertise in-house or in your institutional research area, you need to collaborate with great data people. But also, we haven't even talked about academic planning. And so work with your deans and obviously with provost and the provost staff about what are the programs that perhaps really need some emphasis in your college or university marketing. What are the programs that might attract students of the 21st century? Even, frankly, the names of programs can make a difference. So that kind of academic planning, and again, ensuring that the academic experience that students have is something that can be you in the marketplace, that those first-year experiences, second-year experiences once students are in the major, are the kind that are going to be impactful and provide that kind of great jobs, great lives that the Gallup-Purdue Index talks about. So academic planning has got to be at the table.
Great, and that is a perfect segue. So we're going to our next topic, which is institutional efforts to develop and disseminate value, which is really about collaboration. I think this segment is really about understanding that you, Pam and Matt, and all of you who are on the line cannot do this by yourselves, as has been articulated here. So we want to talk a little bit about what you might be able to do institutionally to move the ball forward on this. So just a couple of little data points here, actually just one. We did ask all of you and all of the enrollment leaders who responded to the survey to tell us where they thought their institutions were effective in driving value, in any efforts they've made to drive value. So what you're seeing here is the percentage of respondents who said that it was extremely or very effective, that their institution was extremely or very effective in this area. And so the most effective areas that were reported were improving the quality of experiential learning opportunities, and that certainly relates to all of the discussion we've heard about outcomes. There's been a tremendous effort in that space, and we've certainly seen that with our clients here at Maguire. Communicating about financial aid and access to students and their family. We've also talked with most of our clients about the need to be really transparent and understandable on cost with folks. Communicating institutional identity and value consistently, so we've seen a lot of brand work. This has happened more in the private domain than the public domain. What we see in the public domain is a real effort to improve the quality of student services that's been successful, so that student service focus and improving the quality of student life in the public domain. But I think what we want to do is look down to the bottom again and see the areas where folks thought their institutions were less effective. And when you read the bottom three, they relate exactly to what Pam was just saying. Improving the quality of academic programs, gathering compelling evidence about outcomes for graduate, which we've already heard a little bit, and certainly adapting academic offerings to align with the market. And we were discussing this internally here yesterday about how difficult that is, because you can't let the market lead you. But to Pam's earlier point, sometimes having the sexy title to the major is what gets the students in the door. So how do you balance that with a long-term strategy for academics at your institution that has real staying power and really fits with your mission? So let's throw it back to Jeff again for your comments in this domain. And really what we want to focus on here is the collaborative efforts that we've begun to talk about.
Yeah, and Kim, what makes it interesting, you were asking, like, in that previous question, or one of the attendees was asking that previous question, kind of who does it, who's in charge of this stuff. And I'm starting to think, I'm not one for administrative bloat, adding more administration at some colleges and universities, but it's interesting to me, particularly as I've reported and researched this over the last couple of years, is that there really is no centralized person on many campuses who's in charge of doing some of the stuff that Matt and Pam were talking about, right? Thinking about, in some cases it might be a planning office thinking about new academic programs, but thinking about outcomes, thinking of partnerships that they could develop with other institutions, with other outside partners. Kind of in the business world, you kind of have a business development function, and in higher ed, kind of everybody does that within their own areas, but you have nobody kind of charged with that at a very high level. And so somebody who could kind of pull together all the stuff that was on that previous slide. And what's interesting to me, and this is really kind of the focus of my next book, is that if higher ed doesn't do it, others are going to do it for you, and you may not like it, especially around these value arguments. So I talk a lot about what LinkedIn is doing. I mean, they have a whole product team dedicated to, in my opinion, kind of putting the U.S. News and World Report rankings out of business in the next 10 or 15 years, because they want to focus a lot on outcomes, and they know 300 million members around the world. They know when a member switches jobs before their institution, their alumni, their home institution does. So, there's going to be a lot of more data products around this in the future, and I think that, the anecdotes that Matt talked about are great now, but I don't think they're going to work in 10 or 15 years. I think there needs to be a much more serious analysis around data and outcomes than we had before. And I don't think many institutions are going to be able to do a lot of this on their own, whether it's the outcomes piece, whether it's new academic programs, whether it's refreshing academic programs, and knowing what the workplace needs. I spent this morning across town here in Washington, D.C. at General Assembly, and I took a 2-hour class on storytelling, and then I sat in on an 11-week course that they're offering on UX, on user design. And what interests me, all the people in the room were college graduates, but they're really liking this idea of taking education and there's not a great word for this, but in chunks, right? They want shorter spurts to get to the end point, and college as we know it today remains very, very traditional. And again, who at the highest levels, and this is where I think the value argument really comes in, who at the highest levels is thinking about this day in and day out? The president will say they are, or, individual vice presidents and deans will say they are, but really, they're in charge of offering that on a day-to-day basis. So I guess my first question for Pam and Matt is, as you look at your own institutions, or maybe let's not say your own institutions, but across higher ed, do you feel like there's a need for a more centralized function to be helping you and the deans and other academic planners, or do you think that you just need more time to do that yourselves?
I guess I'm going to suggest that a combination of leaders needs to do that, but it needs to be a significant part of their agenda. I don't know that a super planner would have the kind of credibility that would be necessary with our faculty. It is true that the for-profits and community colleges are more nimble in this regard, but they don't have the same kind of shared governance that institutions like ours do. And we can't walk completely away from that. So I think it's probably going to have to be not a person, not a visionary guru, but that the visionary conversations need to happen in more deliberate kinds of ways.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that at least, the handful of institutions that I know well enough to comment about, the senior leadership does look to enrollment management to really inform, if not actually lead, those conversations. And so, a very positive and constructive step we can take is to step back, when possible, from the March and April day-to-day crunch and really make sure as a culture our enrollment offices are thinking along those lines, coming up with ideas, solutions, data, et cetera, and making sure those are fed on a continuous basis to the senior leadership of the institution. I agree with Pam that it's really going to be through that channel that everybody kind of understands and respects, rather than imposing kind of an outside or new super planner sort of office that you'd get more immediate traction.
It's interesting to me as I watch higher ed, and I say this often. I got into journalism in the mid '90s, kind of really before the full-on assault of the internet, and then I lived through those early 2000s. When kind of when new ideas, new products kind of took over, and I'm not saying that's going to happen in higher ed, but I guess there's this moment where so fast around you that it's hard to kind of focus on kind of what's next. And I'm thinking particularly around this idea of value, right? So we didn't even ask about value 5-6 years ago in surveys, and now there's a lot of questions around that, right? And we've been talking about tools that you can develop. Pam, you mentioned the Purdue index, but do you really feel like you decided to partner with Gallup on that? Do you really feel, Pam, and I know that you're also part of the University Innovation Alliance along with 10 other big public universities, do you think the time has come that you really can't do this alone, even a place as big and as Purdue, that you really have to cooperate with other institutions or other entities to prove your value and to get help on that story?
I think actually you make a great point, and I've felt that for a long time. I don't know that I can get through a week, if not even a day, without collaborating with my peers in various consortia that I'm privileged to be a part of. They're my sanity check, but they're also my collaborators. And I'm very fortunate that with networks that I have access to, like the AAU and the Big Ten, that we have those kinds of relationships already. But yes, I think we do need to partner with others, and I think you also made a point earlier that if we don't do this and if we don't start to have some strong voices in the public, we're going to have lawmakers more and more tell us how to do what it is we're supposed to be doing. And we already see that. And it's not just lawmakers, it's also foundations and nonprofits who are starting to set, or really in many ways already have, set the agenda for higher education. And if we don't get in the mix of that, our voices are not going to be heard. So, yeah, I don't think individual institutions can be a little disruptive. You can have powerful presidents. I think I have one who can make some noises out there. But it is those partnerships that I think are going to make the difference.
I would only add that I think that the other strength or contribution of collaboration is that kind of a unified message or a set of voices bigger than one person or one institution will have much more effect on informing stakeholders and even shaping the conversation and the culture in which they take place. So I think that's really an essential direction for us to take.
Absolutely. And I think that the stage is set for that. I find even in our work where there's no question that at the enrollment front we compete with one another, that the collaboration, the willingness to share best practices, the willingness even to commiserate is really, really strong. And I think among our presidents, even our trustees, certainly our faculty collaborate across lines all the time. We need to build on that, and we need more of a public voice in that regard.
Right.
What type of pieces of, as you think about kind of this proving the value of your education, Pam, you would now have this Gallup tool that you didn't have even a year ago. What other tools, pieces of data, things and this is a question for both of you, what are the things you don't know that you wish you knew in telling that story? Are there pieces of engagement that you wish you had, or other tools that you wish you had at your disposal to tell that story?
Well, two thoughts. One is that I think we all probably, to some degree and often to a great degree, struggle with just the challenge of gathering the fundamental data that would address the initial questions that prospective students or stakeholders might raise. Figuring out what all the graduates are doing 6 months out or 9 months out, and who's placed and who hasn't, and all those kinds of things would be, and it's been elusive forever. Institutions are paying more attention to it now than they used to, driven by all these factors we've been discussing, but it's still very hard and very challenging to have slice of data that you feel confident is really representative of your alumni experience. And then secondly, I wish there were a more easily communicated and maybe even quantitative way to measure the impact of experiential learning and the kinds of things we've been talking about that in the student experience we understand correlate with success, but struggle to demonstrate in a way that's as succinct as earnings.
I would concur with that. I do think that an investment in surveys, an investment in doing those follow-ups with recent graduates is something that's absolutely critical. We have an army of people in our Career Center and in our schools and colleges that follow up with our graduates with the first 6 months, and we get about a 90% return. So it's valid data, but it is incredibly research intensive.
Well, and the thing is, if you're doing it for a consumer-facing audience, they want comparables, right? So they want to see more than just a group of institutions. They want to see as many institutions as possible. Some institutions, of course, don't want to share that necessarily. So you have things like NESE, right, which institutions don't necessarily share the bad stories. They love to share the good stories. So I think part of this challenge too, right, Pam and Matt, is to have something that's somewhat comparable, at least among like institutions.
Yeah.
I would agree.
This is Kim. I'm just going to break in. We have time, I think, for one chat question, and then we're going to go to closing comments because we do want to respect people's time and end at 3 o'clock. So we have a question from someone who's working in the UK, who's spent a lot of time there working in that model of education and in a model that's really fundamentally changing, finding this conversation interesting and just pointing out that there's a lot of similarities, but the big difference is that the UK culture still really expects a taxpayer to fund the experience and is resistant to loans. So it's kind of a thought question where this person is asking, if you had to start from scratch on these issues, what would the key things be to think about if you're rebuilding the system in some way? It's a big question.
Wow, Jeff's probably had more thought about that than I have. Again, caught up somewhat in the day-to-day. I think one of the things that we have forgotten, though, at least in the United States, and it sounds like maybe it's happening in the UK as well, is that higher education is an investment. It's an investment by the individual, by the individual's family. One hopes by the state, certainly by the federal government. It's an investment in the future of not only individuals, but families, communities, and society. And we've lost that. We talk about cost. We don't talk about investment. And, the old public good versus private benefit, I don't think we've lost that argument yet, but it's slipped. We're not selling refrigerators. We're not selling cars. We're talking about people's lives when we talk about higher education. And again, not just individual people, but their families and society. And I think that's the conversation that we need our leaders to lead in collaboration with one another, that this is an investment that's worth making in our young people, in adults, and for both our nation and the world.
I agree.
Great, and with that, let's go to closing comments. So that was well said, Pam, and maybe we can just give everyone on the phone here just a couple minutes to summarize their thinking on this, and then we'll call an end to our day. Jeff, do you want to start us?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
You go, Jeff.
Okay. So again, thanks everybody for joining us for, I think, this is an important conversation, and I think the challenge right now is one that we've talked about for much of the last hour is trying to make the current situation work while at the same time trying to rethink our policies, our programs, our offerings, and the institution as a whole for the future. And I think it's something that every industry that has gone through change has faced. And I think it's a higher challenge for higher ed, mainly because of what Pam was just talking about, is that I think that higher ed has kind of this multiple, even as a newspaper, we didn't have all these responsibilities for, the public good, the private good, and by the way, there is this ability to kind of respond to the economy as well, to kind of prop up the economy in many towns and cities and states where our institutions are located. So there's so many challenges being put on top of colleges and universities today. At the same time, they really need to be thinking, 10, 15 years in the future. So.
I think that I would say that what I take away from this is that the necessity for institutions to really acknowledge and engage the environment in which we're existing right now, which is data-driven. Consumers are expecting data, and I hate to use such crass commercial sort of terms, but I think if we don't acknowledge that that's shaping the discussion and the concerns that prospective students and their families bring to us, that we're just putting our heads in the sand, and that we have to really look at this as an opportunity to validate the value of the investment, and we'll only be able to do that if we invest the resources on our end to provide meaningful, not just data with regard to incomes and careers and stuff, but student satisfaction, alumni satisfaction in ways that are really meaningful. And that sounds, kind of Pollyannish, or who wouldn't agree with such a thing as that? But acknowledging it and really tackling it are two different kinds of things. And I think there's acknowledgement now, but not been a pattern or even an understanding of how to tackle it.
Thanks, Matt. And we have 1 minute, Pam. So.
Oh, gosh. I can't really say much better than that. The only thing I would add, along with all of these challenges, there is joy in this work. And I have to say that we're admitting over 10,000 students tonight. I can't wait to follow them on Twitter and see their excitement. We can't ever forget that we're in the business of changing lives and how lucky we are to be in that position.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Pam. And thank you, Jeff and Matt, as well. This has been a fantastic conversation. We couldn't have asked for anything better. I want to just let people know that if you have any questions about this study or you want to follow up at all, you can reach me at this contact information here. And other than that, I would love to say thank you again and have a lovely afternoon.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.